Chapter 1. The history book is a lie, and here are the receipts. A word before we begin. Before we get into the facts, let's go to the word first. Because everything that is about to be said in this chapter, every crime, every theft, every act of murder and kidnapping, God already addressed it. God spoke on this long before any of us were born. And the people who came to this land claiming to carry the Bible in their hands broke every single commandment God ever gave. Let's start there. The 10 Commandments, God's law. These are found in Exodus 20, given directly by God to Moses. They are not suggestions. They are commandments. The 6th commandment. You shall not murder. Exodus 20 verse 13. The 7th commandment. You shall not steal. Exodus 20 verse 15. The 9th commandment. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Exodus 20 verse 16. The 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Exodus 20 verse 17. Now keep those in your mind as you read everything that follows. Because the people who came to this land and called themselves Christians broke all 4 of those commandments, not once, not twice, but for 400 years, on an industrial scale, against millions of people. Part 1, what they call discovery, was actually a crime scene. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus landed on an island in the Caribbean. It was already home to the Taino people, a peaceful, organized society. Columbus wrote in his own journal on the 3rd day, "With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." That was not the journal of an explorer. That was the thinking of a criminal. The Taino population on the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, is estimated to have been between 300,000 and 1 million people before Columbus arrived. By 1514, just 22 years later, that number had been reduced to around 32,000. By 1565, it was down to 200. The Spanish colonial authorities officially declared the Taino extinct by 1802. God had already spoken on this. Their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity, wasting and destruction are in their paths. Isaiah 59 verse 7. Thus says the Lord, execute judgment and righteousness, and deliver the plundered out of the hand of the oppressor. Do no wrong and do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place. Jeremiah 22 verse 3. Columbus did not bring God to these people. He brought destruction. He implemented the encomienda system, forced labor, where Taino men were required to deliver a quota of gold every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off. He personally established a trade in Taino girls as young as 9 and 10 years old for sexual slavery. He distributed Taino women to his crew as property. His own government in Spain eventually arrested him for his brutality, not because they cared about the Taino people, but because his crimes were so extreme that even the Spanish crown was embarrassed. Yet today, this man has a federal holiday in the United States named after him. God spoke about people who do evil and then stand in his house and say they are delivered. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, we are delivered, only to go on doing all these abominations? Jeremiah 7 verses 9 to 10. That is exactly what happened. They came in the name of God and committed every crime God forbade. Part 2. The numbers don't lie. 90% of a people were wiped out. Before Columbus arrived, researchers from University College London estimate that approximately 60 million people lived across the Americas, roughly 10% of the entire world's population at the time. That is documented in a peer-reviewed study published in Quaternary Science Reviews. By the early 1600s, just over 100 years after European contact, that number had been reduced to approximately 5 or 6 million. According to that same study, the death toll reached 56 million people. That is 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, gone within a century. The researchers called it the Great Dying. They noted it was the largest human mortality event in proportion to global population in recorded history, second in absolute numbers only to World War II. 90%. Let that number sit with you. In Mexico alone, 50 to 80% of the population died from waves of disease in the 16th century, according to documented historical records. In some regions, the population was reduced by over 90%. And while disease was a major factor, because indigenous immune systems had never encountered European pathogens, historians have made clear that disease alone does not explain the scale of what happened. Slavery, forced labor, starvation, and direct violence all contributed massively to the death toll. Historian Andrés Reséndez of the University of California, Davis, states plainly that on the island of Hispaniola, between 1492 and 1550, slavery was the major killer, not disease. The enslaved could not recover from sickness because they were never given the chance to rest, eat, or heal. Forced labor under brutal conditions made disease deadly in ways it would not have been otherwise. God warned against exactly this. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, nor oppress the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause, and plunder the soul of those who plunder them. Proverbs 22 verses 22 to 23. The people of the land practice extortion and commit robbery. They oppress the poor and needy and mistreat the foreigner, denying them justice. Ezekiel 22 verse 29. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his chambers by injustice, who uses his neighbor's service without wages and gives him nothing for his work. Jeremiah 22 verse 13. Every one of those scriptures describes exactly what colonialism was. Word for word. Part 3. The biggest human trafficking operation in history. Now let's talk about what they did to black people. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, the most comprehensive scholarly record ever compiled on this subject, built from tens of thousands of ship records across multiple countries and continents, 5 million African people were kidnapped from their homes and loaded onto slave ships between 1525 and 1866. That number comes from the database maintained at Emory University and documented by the National Endowment for the Humanities. 12.5 million people. Of those 12.5 million, approximately 1.8 million died during the Middle Passage, the ocean crossing, from starvation, disease, abuse, and despair. They were packed below the decks of ships in spaces so tight they could not sit up. Chained together. No ventilation. No sanitation. Mortality rates averaged above 20% in the early years of the trade, and remained at roughly 10 to 15% even in its later period. Those who survived arrived and were immediately sold. Inspected like animals. Stripped of their names and given English names. Separated from anyone they had bonded with on the crossing. Put to work in fields producing cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice, for no pay, under the threat of the whip. Now let's go to the Word. Because God spoke directly on kidnapping and selling human beings. This is not interpretation. This is the plain text of Scripture. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. Exodus 21 verse 16. Every translation says the same thing. The New Living Translation puts it plainly. Kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. God did not stutter. God did not qualify it. He did not say, except for Africans, or, except if you think they are inferior. The law is plain. Under God's own law, every ship captain who loaded enslaved people onto a vessel deserved death. Every slave trader who sold a human being deserved death. Every plantation owner who held a person in bondage deserved death. That is not this author's opinion. That is the word of God in Exodus 21 verse 16. and Deuteronomy 24 verse 7 confirms it. If a man be found stealing any of his brethren and mocketh merchandise of him, or selleth him, then that thief shall die, and thou shalt put evil away from among you. These people came to this land carrying Bibles in their hands and broke God's law on every page. Paul, writing in 1 Timothy 1 verse 10, lists men stealers, kidnappers, slave traders, alongside murderers and liars as among the lawless who are in direct opposition to the teaching of God. James 5 verse 4 speaks to the wages stolen from workers. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. 4 million enslaved people in the United States alone. Working for nothing. Building the White House. Building the U.S. Capitol. Clearing the land. Growing the crops. Generating the wealth that made this nation powerful. And every dollar of it stolen. By 1860, according to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, 4 million enslaved people produced well over 60% of the nation's wealth. The total value placed on enslaved human beings by that point exceeded $3 billion, more than the combined value of all the railroads, factories, and banks in the country. They were used as collateral for loans, insured as property, bought and sold at auction. And according to research from Harvard University historian Sven Beckert and Connecticut College economist Mark Stelzner, the labor of enslaved people drove approximately 20 to 24% of total U.S. economic growth in the 2 decades before the Civil War, even though they made up only 12% of the population. That is how the wealth was built. Not through innovation. Not through hard work by free people. Through kidnapping, forced labor, and 400 years of stolen wages. God said, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, nor anything that is your neighbor's." Exodus 20 verse 17. And Micah 2 verse 2 speaks directly to what they did. They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses, and seize them. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. That is colonialism described in one verse. Part 4. The Land of Indigenous People and Latino People. Before a single European ship touched the coast of what is now the United States, Mexico, or Latin America, this land belonged to the people who had lived on it for tens of thousands of years. The Americas were home to civilizations that built cities, tracked the stars, developed agriculture, established governments, traded across continents, and maintained sophisticated spiritual systems. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on a lake in what is now Mexico City, had a population of over 200,000 people at its height, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. London, by comparison, had around 50,000. These were not primitive people. These were advanced civilizations. And everything they built was taken. Now let's talk specifically about what happened to Mexican and Latino land, because this is recent history, not ancient history. In 1848, the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which formally ended the Mexican-American War. Under that treaty, signed after U.S. forces invaded and occupied Mexico City, Mexico was forced to hand over 55% of its total territory. That included the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. All of it gone. Transferred to the United States. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million for more than 525,000 square miles of land. That is approximately $28 per square mile. For land that indigenous and Mexican families had lived on for generations. The treaty included provisions promising to protect the property and civil rights of Mexican citizens living in those territories. The U.S. Senate then deleted the article guaranteeing the protection of Mexican land grants before ratifying it. So they broke the treaty before the ink was dry. In the decades after the treaty, according to the Bullock Texas State History Museum's documented historical research, Mexican landowners along the Rio Grande were systematically pushed off land their families had owned for centuries as Anglo farmers and ranchers came to dominate the region. God already spoke on taking what belongs to others by force. He spoke on it clearly, and he spoke on it repeatedly. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right. Isaiah 10 verses 1-2. Do not trust in oppression, nor vainly hope in robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them. Psalm 62 verse 10. Such are the paths of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the life of those who get it. Proverbs 1 verse 19. Part 5. They built laws on top of the crime to protect the crime. Here is the part that people need to understand clearly, because this is why the argument, "It was so long ago," does not hold up. When Columbus returned from the Americas in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal document called the Intercitera. This document declared that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be claimed by Christian explorers. It gave Spain the exclusive right to colonize the Americas. It is the original legal justification for everything that followed. In 1823, more than 300 years later, the United States Supreme Court took that papal doctrine and made it U.S. law in a case called Johnson v. McIntosh. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that European nations had acquired an absolute right to New World lands through the principle of discovery. Under this ruling, indigenous peoples had only a right of occupancy, not full ownership, of their own land. That ruling, the doctrine of discovery, is still the legal foundation of U.S. land law today. They committed the crime. Then they wrote laws saying the crime was legal. Then those laws are still on the books. That is why "it was so long ago" is not an answer. The legal framework built to protect that theft is not long ago. It is active right now, in 2026, in every federal court that hears a case involving indigenous land rights. God spoke to people who write oppression into law. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression. Isaiah 10 verse 1. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name, and say, "We are delivered"? Jeremiah 7 verses 9-10. They passed laws to make their crimes permanent. And then they put the people they robbed in school systems that taught the children of the victims to celebrate the criminals as heroes. God said, "There is only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed." Hosea 4 verse 2. That is a description of colonization in one sentence. Part 6. The history was erased on purpose, continued. This did not happen by accident. People did not just forget what happened. It was removed, rewritten, and replaced. After slavery ended in 1865, the truth should have been told. But instead of telling the truth, the system created a new lie. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy funded textbooks across the United States that rewrote slavery as something benevolent, and painted enslaved people as happy and loyal. They pushed what historians now call the lost cause narrative, turning traitors into heroes and victims into willing participants. Children were taught that slavery was not that bad, that it was about states' rights, that enslaved people were treated well. That was a lie. God already spoke about people who rewrite truth. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Isaiah 5 verse 20. That is exactly what they did. They took slavery, one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation in history, and tried to paint it as kindness. Part 7. After slavery, the system changed forms, not intent. Slavery did not end. It evolved. After 1865, black people were not set free into equality. They were pushed into a new system designed to control them. Black codes. Convict leasing. Chain gangs. Under laws passed across southern states, black men were arrested for minor charges like loitering or vagrancy. Once arrested, they were leased out to private companies to work, again for free. This system was called convict leasing, and historians have documented that the death rates in these camps were often higher than during slavery. Companies did not care if the workers died, because they could just get another one from the prison. That is slavery by another name. God spoke on unjust systems like this. You shall not pervert justice, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. Deuteronomy 16 verse 19. They sell the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of sandals. Amos 2 verse 6. That is exactly what was happening. People were being sold through the legal system. Part 8, Redlining, Stealing Wealth Without Chains, continued. Even in the 1900s, the theft did not stop. It just changed its clothes. In the 1930s, the U.S. government created maps through the Home Owners Loan Corporation. These maps graded neighborhoods for investment. Areas where black families lived were outlined in red. That is where the word redlining comes from. Red meant hazard. Red meant do not invest. Red meant deny loans. Banks followed those maps. Black families were denied mortgages, denied business loans, denied the ability to build generational wealth through homeownership, the same way white families were doing across the country. And while one group was being locked out, another group was being lifted up through federal programs like the Federal Housing Administration, which backed loans, but mostly for white Americans. So one side gets opportunity. The other side gets blocked. That is theft without a whip. Theft without chains. But still theft. God said, do not move your neighbor's boundary stone, set up by your predecessors. Proverbs 22 verse 28. They didn't just move the boundary. They redrew the whole map. Part 9, Mass Incarceration, the continuation. Fast forward to today. The system did not disappear. It adapted again. The United States has about 5% of the world's population, but nearly 20% of the world's prison population. That is not normal. That is not random. Policies like the war on drugs, pushed heavily during the era of Ronald Reagan, led to massive increases in incarceration, especially in black communities. Same crime, different sentences. Crack cocaine, associated with poor black communities, was punished far more harshly than powder cocaine, associated with wealthier, often white users. People were locked up for decades. Families destroyed. Communities destabilized. Labor extracted again, because prison labor still exists. That is not a coincidence. God said, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees. Isaiah 10 verse 1. That is exactly what this is. Part 10, The Wealth Gap, the receipt that still exists. If all of this is in the past, then explain the present. Today, the average white family in America holds significantly more wealth than the average black family. That gap did not appear out of nowhere. It came from 400 years of unpaid labor. Land taken and never returned. Opportunities denied by law. Systems designed to exclude. This is not ancient history. This is a direct line. From plantation to prison to policy. God said, the laborer is worthy of his wages. Luke 10 verse 7. But the wages were never paid. And when wages are never paid, the debt does not disappear. Part 11, What was built, and who built it? Let's be clear about something. The wealth of this nation did not appear out of thin air. Enslaved people. Cleared the land. Built the infrastructure. Harvested the crops that drove global trade. Buildings like the White House and the United States Capitol were constructed in part by enslaved labor. So when people talk about American greatness, they need to tell the whole truth about who paid the cost. God said, "Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, who uses his neighbor's service without wages." Jeremiah 22 verse 13. That is not metaphor. That is history. Part 12. The truth they don't want taught. This is why the history gets watered down. Because if you tell the truth plainly, it exposes the foundation. It raises questions about justice. It forces accountability. So instead, the system teaches. Columbus discovered. Slavery was unfortunate. Everything got fixed. But the receipts say otherwise. God said, "For nothing is hidden that will not be revealed, nor has anything been kept secret that will not come to light." Mark 4 verse 22. The truth does not disappear. It gets buried. And then it gets uncovered. Closing statement of the chapter. This is not about hate. This is about truth. Truth about land that was taken, people who were enslaved, systems that were built on both, and truth about a world that still lives in the result of it. They carried the Bible in one hand and broke every commandment with the other. And the same God they claimed to represent already spoke on all of it. The question is not whether it happened. The question is, what happens when the truth is no longer hidden?